Reporter Ntombi Mia covered the aftermath of the Marikana massacre and the Farlam Commission of Inquiry. She joins us now to just go back there. Ntombi, take us back when you first covered the Marikana Farlam Commission. What was that like for you?
Thank you so much, Desiree. I won't forget the first day I actually went physically to the commission hearings when they moved up to Joburg and Centurion.
From the Northwest?
Yes, they were at the Northwest, and in early 2013 they moved up to Centurion. And it was extremely tense. The mood was very somber. I didn't really know a lot of the people there. It took a long time for me to gain the context and to gain the trust of the different parties that were there. But, as somebody who had come in to the commission proceedings blind, really, it was extremely tense, and it was also very factional, if I may say factional. So if you weren't known, it really does. So if you were not known by any of the role players, either the miners who themselves were there on the day, or either the families or any of the others, it was quite difficult for you to try and get interviews and whatnot. So you really had to, sit in and day out and gain their trust and speak to people and hear their stories and, cry with them when it was time to cry with them, but also have a duty to report factually and with empathy as well.
You didn't know the role players, but you knew the story.
Definitely.
And there's a conversation globally right now about how journalists are affected by the traumatic stories that they cover. How are you able to balance the two, reporting, as you're saying, but also some level of connection to the story?
At the end of the day, we are journalists, and our duty as journalists is to tell the story factually and fairly. That is ultimately our mandate. However, we are humans as well. And, your humanity leads you to have some sort of sympathy towards the families. And it was quite heartbreaking, especially, I won't forget the one year where they had the commemorative events. Yeah. And they had a slideshow. It was sort of like a montage of all the different names of the people who had died, and it included all 44 people that had died in the 7 days preceding the Marikana massacre, as well as the 34 miners who died. And it was so sad, and it was overwhelming, and families were crying, they were hysterical, and they were fainting. It touched you on such a visceral level. But at the end of the day, you have to always remember that in as much as you may feel sympathy for the families that were affected, for the miners who were also involved in the protest action and were shot at by the police and were injured, that you are a journalist, and your duty to the country is to tell the story as fairly as possible with all the information presented before you.
What were your most memorable interviews in that time?
I think my most memorable one was when Mr. X. Now, Mr. X was one of the miners who he claimed he had initially been part of the group of striking miners, and he'd gotten inside intel into the ongoings with the miners. You remember that one of the accusations by the state and the police had been the miners had used muti to try and reinforce themselves against the police bullets. And Mr. X had given this account about how, he knew one of the leaders who had gone to an Nyanga, and they had been reinforced, and etc. And when it was time for him to present his case, and he was examined and cross-examined, he just crumbled. He absolutely crumbled. His testimony crumbled under, continuous probing by the various parties. And it was a very sad time, but it also had light-hearted moments, because his testimony was so at odds with the facts that were before the commissioners. So that was, for me, quite memorable. Mr. X's testimony really provided, it was very sad that it provided such a sad account of what happened, but the moments of humor, I think, helped bring a lot of the different warring parties closer together.
This morning we're reporting on what Lonmin is doing in remembrance, and there was always that division in terms of the role of the employer, the role of government, and how they should have listened to the side of the miners. How did you make that discernment as you were covering that story? Who to talk to and why?
You know, I think on a day-to-day basis, it also really depended on whose testimony was coming up. When Lonmin was brought before the stand, I think it just followed that you would then speak to the families of the two Lonmin miners who, or the two Lonmin police officers, the two Lonmin security officers who were burnt inside the car. And you know, the sad part about the entire Marikana tragedy is that the people who died in the days preceding it, specifically the police officers who were macheted by the striking miners, as well as the security officers from Lonmin, their story was not told to the fullest extent because the deaths of the 34 miners were so overwhelming. But also the families of the Lonmin miners, as well as the families of the police officers, also grieved, and they were also there in the commission hearings. And it led to that tension between the families, the 320 odd families that were represented by Seri, as well as the over 100 miners that were represented by Dalimpofu's team, you know, sort of having a negative attitude towards the families of the police officers who were killed, as well as, you know, the families of the Lonmin security officers. And that was sad. That was really sad, because at the end of the day, you're all in the same boat because you lost a loved one. And the commission's role was to make sure that everybody who was affected got parity and everybody got justice. And that was quite sad.
You're going to a press briefing this morning by the Institute of Security Studies, where Judge Farlam will be presenting a report. Take us back to your sense of the report that came out at that time. Did you think it was balanced?
I thought that the commissioners, Farlam and Dokota, as well as Advocate Hemraj, they gave a very fair and very balanced report in terms of collating all the evidence. There was a ton of evidence. It was massive, and they had the unenviable task of having to sort through everything and listen to everybody's testimonies, with the emotional elements coming in as well. And I think that they did such an outstanding job, and they should be commended for that. And in as much as the political heads that were involved at the time, Natim Teta had been police minister, Susan Shabangu had been minister of minerals and resources, and they were exonerated for their role. To a large extent, they were exonerated as just political heads. However, Susan Shabangu had also been wrapped over the knuckles for exacerbating the situation. But the police, our police in South Africa, need to find a better way of dealing with service delivery or any sort of protest that we have in the country. Because at the end of the day, the miners were not protesting against the police. They were protesting against getting a fair living wage. 12,500 was not a lot of money for the conditions under which the miners deal with underground. It's very hot. It's very dangerous. They're not getting a lot of money. And I think that the commission, the report findings, the final findings, pointing at the police as having been extremely violent in their response to the miners, I think that was quite fair. And that's what we need to deal with, the police's response to how we deal with protests in the country.
Absolutely. We're in conversation with Nozintombi Mia. She was the journalist covering the proceedings at the Farlam Commission, but we also asked you, our viewers, to interact with us on this conversation, and we have a voice note right now. Let's listen in.